the idea behind the piece, basically about a year and a half ago, I knew when I first landed in Egypt that there was something different about the landscape, that I was constantly seeing the US flag, and I didn't think it was a coincidence that the narrative or the questions that were being asked of me, which were rhetorical, when people found out that I left the United States, which is what the piece is called, does anybody leave heaven? In Arabic it sounds like هو حد بيسيب الجنة or يسيب الجنة, and it's literally just, it's a rhetorical question. And so when I kept on being asked that question, I started seeing all these indicators and these symbols of the US flag, and I didn't think that this was a coincidence. This for me was by design. There was Hollywood movies, there was a program in which people were talking about the personal lives of US actors. So I just wanted to create a piece that was large, to think about the saturation of the US flag. I wanted to, initially at the Havana Biennial, to hang it as a tapestry horizontal to the, parallel to the floor, so it almost looked like a painting. And that was in reference to temples in ancient Egypt, that when they painted the heavens with stars. And so I wanted to sort of think about the mythology of heaven in ancient Egypt, and then think about mythology of heaven in contemporary Egypt. Where were we looking, basically? That's the initial reason why I wanted to make the piece, to open up this conversation about the mythology of the United States as heaven. And I've found myself in my neighborhood constantly having to tell people, it's not what you think it is. That's why I'm here, living in Egypt with you, because it's not what you think it is. And I think that that's very important to begin the conversation. I think that leads to other things as inferiority complexes, et cetera, et cetera. And so to empower people, you have to demystify certain things first and begin the conversation there. And that's what I was hoping to begin with this piece. Do I feel the art world is still Eurocentric? Do I feel things are changing? The reality is we are in a bubble. We are in an echo chamber. As diasporic Africans, diasporic folks from the global south, whatever you want to label it, or however you want to understand it, what we talk about is all in foreign languages. And being in the neighborhood that I'm in, which is lower working class, nobody gives a flying shit about these terminologies. It doesn't reach the ground. I think it's important, and I think this is another thing about Cairo, to sort of revert back to this, to bring it into this, what you're saying, or what you just asked me. If we're dealing with inferiority complexes in the global south due to white supremacy and the establishing of certain power dynamics, and it feeds off of inferiority of black and brownness, then the opposite side of that is arrogance and supremacy in Europe and the United States. And I think that that's more dangerous to me, because you can't talk to somebody like that. So at least when I'm in Egypt, I can actually reason with somebody and say, you're more than just what you think you are. And this was by design, that you feel lesser. And I think this sort of, to be honest and open about it, I think this sentiment has been happening since I did a show last December in Rome, 2 years worth of work, and it was reduced to these simple labels. And it wasn't about these simple labels, it was about much more nuanced, complex colonial legacies that are embedded, or were embedded in my father's generation, which he embedded in me, ideas about masculinity, etc. And they missed the ball. So I started questioning things, and then Cuba really just, for me, just opened it all up. So it's still very much Eurocentric. We're still using Eurocentric, like Romance languages to describe our experience. So there's a lot that you miss. While the piece was censored in the Havana Biennial, what they had said to me was that the work was too confrontational in its visual language that I had used for the piece, that basically Cuba had a very complicated relationship to the United States. Again, I was not criticizing the US. I think it was, for me, very clear gesture of hoping to say, okay, there's a phenomenon here happening. And these narratives or these perceptions of the West, in particular the United States, clearly are being informed by this overwhelming presence. And I mean, essentially that's all I was trying to do, was say, hey, there's something going on here. And there's a parallel to what's going on, right? What the narrative being established. If Hollywood is the seed, then the imagery of the US flag constantly being everywhere is the water that plants this idea, right? And helps this idea of heavens and et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that's all I was doing. I wasn't necessarily saying down with America or, I wasn't really criticizing the United States. I was, again, looking at what this phenomenon was and looking at it in the way that this is not normal. People aren't wearing the Egyptian flag in the United States. The average person that's poor and, living in Midwest America isn't walking around with the Egyptian flag, It just doesn't happen. So they're wearing the US flag, And so it doesn't make sense to me. And why they edited it and why they censored it, it doesn't make any sense to me either, because I wasn't criticizing the US. I was trying to make a piece to open up a conversation about why this was happening and how that's connected to the narrative that surrounds the US or Europe in general.